Welcome to the Odd Ones Out podcast. If you ever feel like you're on the outside looking in, you are not alone. Let's challenge our limiting beliefs and embrace who we truly are. The Odd Ones Out podcast is obviously me and Maz. So I'm Becky and Maz is my husband. But what we're going to be doing in the next couple of podcasts is actually focusing on each of us as individuals. So you have the benefit of my dulcet tones pretty much all to yourself in this one. But I have asked Maz to kind of be around and interject at points where either I might have a question for him to remind me of something or he just thinks of something to share, which would be great. We have set the intention of exploring our root convictions. So the whole concept of feeling like an odd one out, we believe, fundamentally comes back to something that holds us back from just being ourselves. And that root conviction is that thing, and it causes limiting beliefs and drives behaviors that really just, they niggle, they don't sit well, and not just hold us back, but actually make us just not feel right in the world. Yeah. And so mine is just not feeling good enough. So I wanted this podcast episode to just give you a bit more information about where that came from and how it's impacted, affected, less dramatic, just kind of caused things to play out in my life, because I'm now in my mid-40s and this has been something that came from childhood. So that not feeling good enough, to be fair, I didn't acknowledge that it was a root conviction until during lockdown. So I was struggling with stress. I was feeling anxious on certain days, nothing too dramatic, but enough that was stopping me from really feeling happy. Yeah. And I spoke to Maz about it and was saying, look, something's just not feeling right. And actually there are some things and some days I find harder than others to really just be me. That human being, not human doing thing about, don't just be a functioning adult. And I actually went for some local CBT sessions with a local health centre. And it was during those CBT sessions that I was able to acknowledge, do you know what, actually, all of these things that I feel or do on a daily basis can be attributed to just not feeling good enough. And those CBT sessions started making me look at, okay, how to have self-compassion, yada, yada. But actually, even those things can sometimes be easier said than done. So for the last 3 years, I've really been working on that, trying to acknowledge, oh, hang on, this comes from that feeling of not being good enough. But how did it all start? And like I said, it goes back to childhood. I grew up in a household where my parents were very busy with their day jobs. And my dad was a vicar and my mum taught in a school for special needs children who were profoundly mentally and physically disabled. So it took its toll on her. And I think my dad's job also took its toll on her. And she'll admit to suffering from depression and low mood. And again, nothing too dramatic. I mean, this is all quite insidious stuff. But when you've got parents that are incredibly absorbed in being brilliant members of their community and brilliant kind of professions, unfortunately, it can take its toll on a child. Yeah. And ultimately, we're narcissists or solipsists. You taught me that word a couple of years ago. Solipsist, is it? When you're... What's the difference between the two?
I think even I've forgotten at this point.
Okay.
Solipsist sounds fancy.
Yeah, narcissist is when everything has to be about you and you're kind of like, you want to be the centre of attention. Yeah. Not solipsist is when it's just... you're in your own head kind of thing. I don't know. I should Google it. Anyway, so yes, you're a child. You find things a struggle and you take things on as yourself. So when I wasn't getting recognition for doing well or just getting the love that I needed, not being fed well. Sorry, Mum, because Dad passed away at 17, so I don't need to say sorry to him. Sorry, Mum, if you're listening. I wasn't fed well. I wasn't really looked after that well. That feeling of not being good enough and just not being easily dismissed. The whole growing up in the 80s, there was a mentality in family life. You know, you might be heavily disciplined and you might be shut away because the adults wanted to talk and have time, but that kind of started that ingrained feeling of not feeling good enough. And then as time went on, bullying in school, not really fitting into friendship groups, always feeling a bit of an outsider, a validation of not being good enough. And bit by bit, there were different milestones in my life that where the fundamental not feeling good enough came from childhood. So it was strong and it was embedded, because when something happens in childhood, it can't help but be embedded until you are at an age where you're able to properly address it and work through it. Yeah. So those milestones continued where my dad died during my A-levels, and then I went to university, and I felt like an outsider because I was dealing with grief and also dealing with, because he was a vicar, we had to move out of my childhood home. It came with the church. And the church in itself, the community of the church, were trying to deal with their grief, having lost this amazing man for them. Unfortunately, not the most amazing father, but an amazing man for him meant that they didn't really know how to support us as a family. And so then it's kind of like, well, I'm not good enough to actually be looked after by this church that we've given our kind of family life to. And then I felt like an outsider at university because I didn't feel good enough. And it all kind of wove itself in, made some amazing friends, which I still have to this day. But ultimately, I'm talking about this deep-rooted feeling, this feeling of not being good enough. It doesn't matter how many people tell you, oh, you're great, and I loved this, and I really enjoyed that about you, Beck, this is great. If you don't feel it yourself, it means nothing, unfortunately. And that's a shame for those people who actually bothered to give me their love and their goodwill and words. But I carried on going through life, and during it, from a childhood, the not feeling good enough manifested itself in an eating addiction. The only way I could go to feel better, to feel nurtured, was to overeat. That was the one thing that I carried, and I carried it through childhood, teenage, in my 20s to now. I still struggle with a food addiction. I've also had to deal with not being able to conceive easily. So we had to go through IVF for our children. That was a huge validation of the universe telling me that I wasn't good enough. And every single time I have had a milestone which has been difficult, I pretty much lost a job that I nearly got burnt out trying to do the best that I could do. And I was doing a phenomenal job, but it wasn't quite the job that the owner of the company was hoping I would do. We had a complete miscommunication. That's ultimately what happened. Miscommunication. I was breaking my back to do a phenomenal job and achieved great things. I was doing a great job, but I wasn't doing the job that she wanted me to do. Yeah. And so ultimately, in a way, I felt like I lost that job. I had to move on. Validation. I'm not good enough. I was actually very good enough at doing the job that I understood I should do. Yeah. But I wasn't doing the job she thought I was doing, and therefore, in general, that's it, I'm not good enough. Yeah. So I'd lost my job. I've gone through IVF. I've got to a point now where there are things that hold me back, that have driving behaviours on a daily basis, and they are rooted in this root conviction of not being good enough. As a functioning adult, I'm impressive. I do really well, speaking for myself.
Well, and I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think this is what was occurring to me when you were talking, that people won't realise how together you come across to other people. I'm sure nobody would have any clue that you had this past or that you had much self-doubt at all, really, because you're confident, you're on the extrovert side of things with some introvert tendencies, but you seem comfortable with yourself. And I think as you were talking about it, it occurred to me that there must be so many people in that position, maybe even the majority of people who have those self-doubts that I'm not good enough, but they're just probably conditioned to accept it. You get on with everyday life, and there are different ways you might deal with that kind of core root conviction. One of them, I think, in your case anyway, was just to keep going and to cope.
Roll my sleeves up, just deal with it. It's fine, move on.
Yeah, in which case you can be under the sort of the you can sort of convince yourself that everything's okay, and that as you've sort of said in the past, that you're ticking all the right boxes, that you have everything you need. And there isn't really the impetus to challenge that kind of core belief, because the evidence...
On paper, it looks all right.
The evidence isn't there there's no immediate kind of need to deal with it. And I think so many people are probably in that position. But having that core belief and holding it and kind of maintaining it, if you like, means that, at least from my experience of being with you for a long time now, that it makes it difficult for you to be receptive to other people's praise, for example, or opportunities that might come your way. It's you need to be quite tunnel visioned and single minded to just barrel through your day, get all the things you need to get done, and that in itself becomes the achievement. But I think, as you've realised over the last few years, and we've talked a lot about this, that you want more than that.
Yeah.
And the fact that you've lived a certain way for the last 40 odd years doesn't mean that you necessarily have to continue in that vein.
No, exactly.
Forevermore.
And it's ultimately how I feel that matters, because at the end of the day, I get into bed, I close my eyes, it's just me, and I am fundamentally not that happy. I'm not, and it was a complete revelation to understand and acknowledge and identify, really, that whole I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
Because I had gone, so this was only 3 years ago, I had gone all of my adult life until my 40s knowing that something wasn't quite right, but and knowing really my childhood wasn't that great, and yes, I'd had difficulties, but I was resilient, and isn't this amazing? And that resilience was something to be proud of. Even even when our children were born 3 months early, because we've got twins, and they were born 3 months early, I wasn't good enough to keep them in my womb. I'd not only found it that the universe didn't think I was good enough to have children easily in the first place, that I needed IVF to help, but that my body couldn't even keep them inside me for the full 9 months. Everything was there, but I wasn't able to acknowledge that was this root conviction, this core belief. And it was only when I had that revelation of identifying it 3 years ago that other things have fallen into place, and I don't want to accept being a great functioning adult anymore. It's not enough. I want to feel better. I want to feel lighter. I want to feel happier, and that I can embrace things like spontaneity. Like you said, on the face of it, I come across a bit of an extrovert. Now, we both know I'm an introvert. I just am. I like my own time, my own space. I like silence. Don't be too noisy. But in a social environment, I can be quite chatty and happy and come across, and I know myself. But that's on a superficial level. Actually, you get any deeper and I'm quite guarded. Not consciously guarded, but I still feel like I'm on the outside. I'm very quick to judge what I have to offer. I can, in my professional life, I'm very confident, and I get praise regularly, and people appreciating what I do. But even with those, sometimes it's like, so I should. Because I've worked hard. There's always a because or a but or whatever. And it's like, I don't want those things holding me back anymore. So yes, this isn't a self-pitying thing of I'm not good enough. It's me saying, if you don't feel good enough, is that your root conviction? Because if you don't feel it, are there ways that it's holding you back? And maybe you're like me, where you're at a point where you just don't want to accept that feeling of things not being right, because why not reach for more? Why not reach for something better? Why not reach for that lighter, more open, happier life? And to be perfectly honest, I'm also not that driven to change.
Yes.
So I can say, I'm not sitting here like this guru, oh my goodness, I had this revelation and I've made all these changes and now I'm the other side. Because I will say to myself, I know what, why don't I try this thing that I've heard from Mel Robbins or any other kind of guru, or this self-help thing that's happened, or and I will say, I'm going to do it. And I do it for 2 or 3 days and then I forget. And then life takes over and functioning takes over, because the habit and the ingrained piece is just dealing with stuff.
Yeah, but I think as well as you probably discovered, even sort of comparatively recently, I think a lot of that apathy, if you like, or forgetfulness is also a resistance in itself. And it's really, although you've done a hell of a lot of work towards dealing with that I'm not good enough and unraveling the root causes and everything, it's still very difficult to delve back into, and sometimes it's difficult to know how to as well. You might think, okay, fundamentally I've internalized this belief that I'm not good enough. Now what? And it's very difficult to kind of say. I mean, I probably, unfortunately, probably pester you quite a lot with new things that I've heard of. And have you tried this? And what about that?
It's a good thing.
And it's all done with the best of intentions. But I think it's difficult sometimes to sort of square. Okay, these basic practices, these things that can kind of build up over time. How do you sort of square that with this really heavy kind of deep fundamental belief and kind of use them to gradually dismantle that and to sort of form new beliefs? Because this is the other part. It's not just challenging that core belief, but it's replacing it with something. Because I think it's one thing saying I'm not good enough, but then you kind of, I don't know, you can't necessarily just replace it immediately with the opposite. You can't just say, I'm good enough.
Because it's powerful. It's actually, there's a very strong feeling there, and I can't find a counterweight.
And you've built up over the years, as you kind of said before, you've built up a bank of evidence to support that point of view. Even if it's completely skewed, your head has been almost sort of programmed to find evidence to corroborate that and to confirm your kind of suspicions. So it's something that takes time. But I think the first, the most important thing is to recognise that that's there, and I think it's amazing that you got to that point.
I truly mean it when I say it was a revelation, because it so many things fell into place, and it also gave me the path to know how to unpick it.
Yeah.
I knew I therefore had to go back to my childhood and really sit. That was hard.
Yeah.
Sit with the things that happened in my childhood that contributed to me not feeling good enough. A father who was a big discipliner in a physical way, and that I'm still dealing with. That was really hard, because the disciplining came sometimes from not actually needing to be done, for example.
Yeah.
And actually, the other way of the other thing about trying to unpick that kind of root conviction, that really fundamental core belief, is that it's tiring. Whenever I start talking about anything that's to do with negative emotion, I start yawning.
You fall asleep.
I fall asleep. I start falling asleep when we're talking about it. I find it, my body literally wants to shut down. But also, when you say about squaring up, it made me think, I can't square that need to feel vulnerable, to be able to really live in that feeling and embrace it, to be able to then deal with it and let it go.
Yeah.
I can't feel vulnerable and function really well and remember all the things that have to be done on a practical basis and deal with work and feel like I can rock up and be as professionally as amazing as I want to be, as I feel like I have to be. Another way of kind of counteracting the not good enough is that I have to be super good, the best in my professional life. It's just one of those ways it plays out. But feeling vulnerable and being amazing at being functioning well and professional just don't mix for me. So therefore things get dropped, subconsciously get dropped. It's honestly not an active thing where I say, I should be doing this thing that I've thought of, but I'm not going to do it, because actually it just doesn't come in. I completely forget to do it.
Yeah.
So there is that how on earth do I keep moving forward on this journey of addressing the thing that's really hard and unraveling it. And, yes, I recognise, and well done me. I have to say well done me because I actually don't say it very often. Well done me for dealing with quite a lot of their childhood stuff and trying to reframe the things like with the IVF and the kids being born early as not being to do with me not being good enough, but just it is what it is.
Yeah.
But how do I keep that going at the same time as trying to continue achieving, which has been my self-validation for so long?
Yeah, and when you talk about this, and it tends to kind of feature quite a bit when we talk about this kind of thing, but it always comes across to me that you as you say, it sounds quite tiring, it sounds quite energy sapping, that it takes, no matter how brilliant you are at it, it takes a lot of energy to maintain this public face. It takes a lot of energy to hold this not being good enough. Everything is at cost to you. And even, you're talking about being vulnerable. To you, until very recently, and maybe even still now, to you, the idea of being vulnerable is something you can't fathom maintaining whilst you have that professional face. The two can't coexist in your mind.
I don't know how. And I sincerely see vulnerability as a strength. I don't see it as a weakness. I think somebody who's able to feel vulnerable and then just see where that takes them in life is a huge strength.
Yeah.
And it's not even me saying I don't have the strength. I don't get it. When you're like, come on, feel vulnerable. I'm like, how? I don't know how to do it.
Well, because I suppose you never. It's like anything. If you don't acquire the language for it, if you're not in that mindset, it's difficult to just start. Where you can't just kind of concentrate.
Do you learn it as a kid? I mean, because as a child, I had to be resilient. I had to be self-reliant. I couldn't. There was no vulnerability. If I felt vulnerable, I was. Not these words, but I was basically told to buck up if it was even acknowledged that I was feeling vulnerable. It was like, sorry, we're too busy. So I don't know. I don't know if it comes from childhood and maybe that's what's I find a struggle, but I know that vulnerability coexisting with the energy of feeling, I'm coping with the day and I'm dealing with the day. I don't know if that's why I find it difficult.
Yeah, and I suppose vulnerability, quite rightly, is synonymous with your emotional health and the value you put on emotions as well. And I think growing up in that household, emotions were pretty low down the priority list. I mean, if you're not given a healthy outlet for emotions or encouraged to express them, how can you be vulnerable? I mean, vulnerability is all about feeling how you feel, being however you want to be on that given day, and allowing people to see that. But if you don't know how to do that and no one's there to listen in the first place, it's no wonder that as an adult, even at this point, it's something that feels a bit artificial, and it's taken time. I mean, I think you've come a long way, and even sort of with me, you're able to talk really openly now about how you're feeling, but it's still not natural.
No, it isn't. It's an effort.
Yeah.
It's 100% an effort.
Yeah.
So that's where. So obviously, this particular episode is just me opening up and sharing what my root conviction is. I am not good enough. No matter how much work I've done in the last 3 years, it's still there, and I wonder if it might be there forever. But the point is, how does it manifest itself? What behaviors are driven by it? How can I reduce its power and impact on my day-to-day life and how I feel about myself as a person? That's my ongoing journey. That's what it's managing it rather than trying to completely get rid of it. I think that's more realistic for me. So in upcoming episodes, in terms of how my side's going to play out, I will start going into just addressing the behaviours that come from the root conviction of not being good enough, the addiction that I have to food, the need for reassurance and praise, and how I might counteract that. It could be just how I deal with things on a day-to-day basis. But basically, I'm going to be exploring the behaviours that are driven by my root conviction, because maybe they're the ones that are easier to acknowledge, perhaps for you as you're listening. Maybe you don't resonate. It doesn't resonate with you about the feeling of not being good enough yet, or it just doesn't. But maybe some of the driving behaviour, the behaviour, that it drives might be things that you experience, and therefore me playing out how I address them, how I feel about them might help you. But our next thing really on the list is to focus on Maz's root conviction.
I get
plural.
I get to have a turn. Yeah, I think, I found it a little harder to condense mine into one root conviction. But I think what I settled on, which probably informs a lot of what I do, is that I've never really felt like I belonged. And I will go into lots more detail in the next podcast. But I think that certainly drives a lot of the things that the way that I do things. And it, again, in a different way, it's difficult. It's been difficult for me to address that directly, because I suppose I'm not as much of a coper as Becky is. I do look at sort of how I'm feeling, and I check in with myself quite a bit.
You're good at that.
I think it's just innately something that I've always done. But at the same time, I think it's had possibly even a different kind of an effect on my adult life. But it's really held me back, and I hope to be able to go into sort of a lot more detail in the next podcast and to explain how that's manifested itself and what I try and do about it. Because again, on the surface, I'm a very cheerful person. I'm upbeat. I'm not negative at all. I don't think anyone would sort of see me that way.
No.
But it's still there. And it's taken a long time to really get to the bottom of it and to figure out what to do. And it's an ongoing process. But hopefully some of the tips and the ideas that I can share in the next podcast may help any of you out there who can relate.
Yeah.
And then, as Becky says, in future podcasts, we might go into a bit more about the behaviours that are triggered by those bottom lines, and eventually open it up to you guys and make this whole thing a bit more interactive. Hopefully, you will be able to share some of your stories, and
For now, I'm going to be saying goodbye and wrapping it up, but I just want to invite you to post us a comment, a question, or how you feel having listened to this. Does it resonate with you? Sometimes it's just quite nice to know that you're not alone. So in that reassurance need, only kidding. If there's anything that I've said that you have felt in a similar, you've experienced a similar thing, or you feel a similar way, please do share. It would be lovely to hear from you and to look back, and we'll respond as often as we can. So anything that you want to share, please do. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
See you next time.